We're pretty traditionally Presbyterian.
I love to call Jesus' name because he said he would. Well, now there's a man.
A man got to have a code.
That is why. Whoa, yeah.
A man must have a code. No doubt.
You see, ladies, I'm not just a Presbyterian. I'm a Scottish old believer Presbyterian.
How he plants his footsteps on every way, and he lightens every load. When he speaks my name, when the battle is up, oh, I got Jesus, and that's enough. That's why. That's why. That's why.
This is Westminster.
Good evening, or whenever you're listening this, to all the Westminster Assembly Presbys out there. We're Presbycast, Presbyterian here, Chortles Weekly, co-hosting as well. Thank you if you're watching live and participating. We appreciate you standing by. We like to think of it as a big show tonight, so in proper fashion, we wanted to let it build for just a few more minutes. I can see that we're getting viewers are trickling on in, and we've already got some comments going. If you're watching live, thanks for doing that. If you're listening on demand on whatever your favorite podcast app is, thank you for doing that as well. But we'll go ahead and get right into it. I'll throw it to Chortles. He will introduce our guest, whose name you will likely recognize, and we're excited to have this person on the show and go for a half Rogan or so.
All right. Well, I started thinking, who are the most famous PCA Presbyterians in this country? I thought, well, Tim Keller's number one. Dave Ramsey, if he's still PCA, I don't know if he is. He might be number two. Maybe he's number one. Scott Sauls is working himself up there. David French, he would certainly be one, but our guest, he's top five. It's Erickson, a multimedia star and PCA church member, at least. Are you an officer, Erick?
I used to be. I'm not now.
You were a deacon at one time?
Yes, I was.
Yes, someone told me that. So, so you actually bring a sort of a man in the pew perspective to this, more than a theology geek or teaching elder or someone like that. But beyond all that, you are actually a seminarian. You're working slowly towards a degree at RTS.
I am. Move for a while up to Southeastern Baptist to work on the PhD, but turns out me and independent study don't get along, so I've got to be back in the classroom. But just started doing 5 hours of radio a day, so I'm also having to put it on a side burner right now. I'm about 3 years in.
All right, so what sort of degree is that? And I gather it's at RTS Atlanta.
Yeah, RTS Atlanta. It's a Master's of Biblical Studies. So it's an MDiv without the 400 hours of practical hours that RTS requires.
Well, that's better than a D-Min, so that's good.
Absolutely.
Good. Yeah, there was an article years ago called The Demonization of the Ministry, and it was meant to sound like demon, but anyway. We'll
one day I'll just get the DD and everybody will know I didn't do it, but I've got the degree.
Well, you should scare up an honorary degree like all these Baptist preachers do.
I'm thinking so.
Well, I know some people. We'll work on that for you, maybe. So, why are you in the PCA? I mean, how long have you been in the PCA, and why are you here?
So I grew up Southern Baptist in Louisiana. Grew up in Dubai and would come home during the summer and go to my grandmother's Southern Baptist church where I grew up, and went to Mercer University Baptist School in Macon, Georgia. And the first Sunday there, I thought, I'm going to the First Baptist Church in rural Jackson, Louisiana. I'll go to the First Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia. And I went in, and the woman in the pulpit that Sunday was preaching how we were too scriptural and not sacred enough, and I had no idea what that meant, but it didn't sound right. So I went home and called my pastor and said, Brother Joe, what should I do? And he said, well, there aren't any good Baptist churches over there. Find something that has the letters PCA next to it. I'd be one, but for the sprinkling. So
Wow.
I went into a PCA church and have never left.
You know, a lot of people forget that there were liberals in the Southern Baptist Convention in pretty great numbers, even up. So what year are we talking about? 80s,
This was actually
90s?
93, and it was actually it was a
90s.
cooperative Baptist church, not an SBC, a Southern Baptist church. I didn't know what I didn't know what the cooperative Baptist church was at the time. I just assumed if you were a Baptist church, you were a Southern Baptist church.
Yeah.
Little did I know.
Yeah, at that time, most of those churches were still formally Southern Baptist, but
Right.
they were part of the CBF, which is kind of like an affinity group within the Southern Baptist Convention. But it's good that you either knew to flee or someone told you to go.
Right.
So you're in Macon now.
I am.
So
I go to
is that where
First
you
Pres
live?
in Macon.
All right, so I made a detour from the Atlanta General Assembly through Macon, so I could see the house where J. Gresham Machen's, that's the Machen horn, where his grandparents lived. Have you been to that?
This is new. I had no idea.
Well, let's see. I wasn't sure. Yeah, it's called the something inn. I can't remember.
1842.
That's it.
Wow, I had no idea that was his great. Wow.
Yeah, he didn't grow up there, but his mother did, and he spent a lot of time there.
Well,
So-
interestingly enough, the owners of the 1842 Inn are in church with me at First Pres.
Well, that's appropriate. Well, you
Yes.
should, yeah, well, good. Yeah, I took a number of pictures and tweeted those out, and our friend Daryl Hart, the church historian, he stayed there, and he's quite familiar with it as well. So there you go. Now you know more about Macon. You know, that's good. So what do you think the strengths of the PCA are? I mean, why you tried it out, you stayed. Why is that?
Well, I would say it's as close to the Southern Baptist as you can come growing up. Although my wife complains that many of the songs are the same, just changed words for theological orthodoxy. It drives her insane. The songs
True.
she grew up with as a child, she starts singing and realizes they've changed some of the words on them. But it's most of the people I go to church with, I think either were raised in that church or were Baptist, and we have better Bible studies with better cigars and bourbon collection than you get in the Southern Baptist Church. But otherwise, you get theological orthodoxy. Personally, I like it because there is an intellectual rigor to the PCA that you don't find in some churches that aren't ordered in the way a Presbyterian church is. There's a theological, intellectual rigor in the church, the writers, the voices that you have, and oftentimes what you find in sermons in most PCA churches, in my experience, are not just expository, but actually delve in not just to scripture reading with the story that, you know, how in standard preaching, let's read the Bible verses. Now, let me tell you an anecdote that I'm going to shoehorn into the story before we dive deep. You actually get a lot more depth than in a lot of pulpits in a lot of different churches with the PCA.
I don't remember who wrote this, but many years ago, someone they described the PCA as the the destination for upwardly mobile Southern Baptists, and that's not just economically upwardly mobile, but maybe socially and theologically. So I took it.
Right.
I took it to have multiple layers of meaning there. And of course, I grew up Southern Baptist like most people in my church, but not all. Not all. We've got some cradles, and we've got Reformed people from all over the country in our church. But that's one of the good things about being distinctive. It does attract people for that reason, and not just for social or ethnic or outside of church affinity reasons. And
Right.
very few of our churches are parish churches either. I mean, it's not just everybody walks to church. A lot of people drive 20, 25, 30 minutes to get to their PCA church, and that's good. And so that's just that's something we have to deal with. So you appreciate the PCA, but we should say something else for those who don't know you. if I've got this right, you do a streaming show in the morning, and then you're on the biggest talk radio show station in Atlanta in the afternoons. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So I do a 9 to noon show that's syndicated just in Georgia. And then I do the evening drive time on WSB, which is the most listened to talk station in the country, from 4 to 6 in the evening.
So you're not talking religion most of that time, though I'm sure
Right.
it comes up from time to time.
You know, it's the reason that I went to seminary actually was because I do talk about culture and theology on the radio, kind of just, I mean, it's my worldview. So it comes out, and was getting asked to fill in on Sundays. Small Baptist churches would call and say, could you fill in? And it's very awkward for me. I've never been to seminary before. I didn't want to fill in for a pastor. I didn't even know whether I could preach or not. And finally, after this happened several times, I decided maybe this is God's way of saying I should go to seminary. So I went to RTS Atlanta. John Soul, who's then the president, took me out to lunch and said that I needed to make him a promise before I went to seminary. And I asked him what. He said, you've got to make the promise before I tell you what you're promising. So I did. And he said, okay, don't go to seminary. And I wanted to know how this would work. And he said, well, the way it would work is very simple. Come take any classes I wanted to take, learn as much as I wanted to learn, take the systematics, take the apologetics. Just don't go in with a seminary mindset. Otherwise, I'd ruin my radio career, and that would be more important long term. So I went, mentioned on radio I was going to seminary. A lot of these churches called back. When they found out I was going to a Reformed seminary, suddenly they really were busy that Sunday and didn't necessarily need me to fill in after all.
Huh. Well, there you go. Well, when I was in the Southern Baptist Church and we were without a pastor for a while, I think we had the manager of the local Chick-fil-A came and spoke one Sunday. So I'd rather hear you than the Chick-fil-A manager. But he
be a Reformed guy in a free will pulpit just didn't seem like it would work so well.
Yeah, when he told the story about the getting to touch the couch that Truett Cathy prayed on when he just decided to start the business, I checked out at that point. Like
I was told we didn't have relics in Protestantism. I was told relics were not there.
Usually they sit on the back row in our church.
Oh, the relics, yeah. Oh boy. Well, you're a pro. There's no doubt. So, and I also have I know what we're going to talk about tonight. I've got to brag on my wife because I read an Ibram X. Kendi quote to her.
Oh boy.
And we were also talking about Malcolm X. So she named Ibram X. Kendi Malcolm Next, which I thought was pretty good. I mean, I said, you'd make an internet troll if you just put your mind to it.
Right.
Well, who was it? Somebody called Sean King Talcum X. So Malcolm Next and Talcum X. That's a very nice W tag team. Maybe like the mid 90s.
Yep. And we're banned from Twitter just like that. So before the show's over. So you wrote an article called Warnings in the PCA. Could have been called Warnings to the PCA or Warnings about the PCA. Why did you do that before we sort of work through it?
In large part because I have a number of friends of mine who are in the PCA. No, I do have a platform and I'm in the PCA, and I've been reading about some of the things that were going on with critical theory and certain pastors. It really headed down the woke pastor road of let's embrace racial reconciliation, which I actually agree with, but let's do it from the perspective of affiliating with certain outside non-church groups like Black Lives Matters, and increasingly hearing people talking about critical theory. So I decided I needed to get educated, and talking to a number of pastors. I actually talked to a lot of PCA pastors in writing this and pointing me to resources. Several different people in separate conversations pointed me to something that Greg Thompson wrote, who is, I refer to him in the piece as a pastor, but several people said, no, he actually prefers teaching elder. So teaching elder Greg Thompson wrote in defense of Marxism, and was kind of shocked to learn that he is getting some sort of fellowship, or has gotten a fellowship at Grace DC, which is the largest PCA church in Washington. which is rapidly moving, it seems, towards social justice warriorism. I've got a lot of respect for the church and the pastors there, but the more I read and the more I see what's happening, I'm increasingly concerned. I know a lot of people are concerned about the intellectual rigor of the PCA being embraced or modified to some degree by the emotion of the Black Lives Matters movement, and a lot of people willing to cast out the intellectual rigor of really historic authorship within Christendom to embrace worldly views and embrace critical theory, which is derived from Marxism. And they're all very honest about it being derived from Marxism, but like Saruman, they seem to think they can harness the things of the world and be just fine.
Let me clarify one thing. Greg Thompson was pastor of, I think it was Trinity Presbyterian in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Right.
Now he is a teaching elder. That's technically his office, but he's not a pastor. So that's probably why he emphasizes that. One of the things about the Presbyterian, the PCA, is that we have a lot of ministers who are not tied to a local church. That would explain him at this point, to my understanding. He is associated with an institute or a parachurch organization associated with that church, which you mentioned, the Grace Network in D.C. But anyway, just to clarify that for people, if you're a teaching elder, you have to have a call of some sort, and his call is basically to the parachurch, and some pretty except for that association, pretty much secular racial reconciliation agencies. And some people would say, well, that's the Lord's work, so that's fine. But that's arguable. You don't find that in many other Reformed denominations. The teaching elders are pastors, the pastors are teaching elders, and that's pretty much the way it works. So let's look at your article. You say I'm in the PCA, and you say that it has slowly shifted to the left. It has been slowly shifted to the left by a group of pseudo intellectuals. You note that there are at least not so much revoice, but the racial reconciliation has caused waves in the SBC, and then you make the provocative. It's almost like you know how to do this. You make the provocative statement with the PCA. It's a Tim Keller problem. Now you qualify that, but let's talk about that. In what respect are some of the trends in the PCA that trouble you Tim Keller problems?
We live in a society, and this goes beyond the PCA. We live in a society where the large pastors, you've got multi-campus pastor ministries with massive book deals and TV exposure, syndicated columns, so the celebrity pastorship. Within the PCA, I think Tim Keller is probably the celebrity pastor within the PCA, and he has retired. And I think there are a lot of people who would like to take his place. There are also a lot of people who worked under him at Redeemer who have spread out across the campus planning churches. And I think to some degree they philosophically misunderstood some of Keller. And I say it's not about him because, to his credit, Keller in just the last year has been one of the leading voices, I think, within the PCA against critical theory. And against some of the wobbliness on biblical sexual ethic that some of the people who came out of Redeemer and some of the people who want to be the next Tim Keller seem to be embracing. This we must be filled with whimsy, and we must be so concerned with the pastoral care of our flock that we're not able to disrupt rock or give hard truths to people. And Keller, I think, to his credit, has been saying, no, there are hard truths that have to come out. And it's very weird to me to see some of these people so concerned with pastoral care that they're no longer really concerned with orthodoxy. And I don't think you can really care pastorally for people if you're leading them to hell.
Well, some of it's generational. I mean, Keller's no spring chicken. And the people you refer to, and we'll get to this, you say it's really Keller's disciples more than Keller. That's the problem. But the younger generation, and I'm pretty much saying anybody younger than me, I even see it in people who are 40, in their 40s. With everything is about relations. Everything is relational, and it's all about relationships. It seems sometimes at the expense of objective truth or confessional orthodoxy. I think that's kind of the point you're making.
That's well said. And it does seem like there's been an overcorrection into relation building to the point where you can't bring out the hard truths lest the relationship be disrupted.
Well, I would draw the line all the way back to Francis Schaeffer with his strong emphasis on cultural engagement. My take is if you're going to engage the culture in the city and the arts and all that sort of thing, you're going to have to deal with a lot of homosexuals. That's just the culture of the city. Maybe not Macon, maybe not the town I live in, but in a major world city, you're going to have to deal with that. And,
Right.
We can see Revoice as an attempt to do that, but we don't have to. We can say that the intentions are good, but we don't have to agree that it's being done properly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another aspect of this. So you're careful to say this is not a critique of Tim Keller, a criticism of Tim Keller, and then you explain that, which you've already done, that Keller's not really the problem. We'll go and look at the second.
Which, if I could just say, I'm actually surprised by the number of people who have responded to this and said, oh, yes, he is. This is all Tim Keller's doing. And I'm always amazed when I ask people, because I was in this, for several years, I was fairly critical of Keller and finally realized, I'm reading what other people characterize Keller as. Let me read Keller myself. And I notice increasingly that most of the people who are very down on Keller, even within the PCA, aren't actually reading Tim Keller. They're reading what people say about Tim Keller's critics. And when you actually read the primary sources, I don't necessarily agree with him on everything, but I do think that he's not exactly how a lot of his critics have characterized him. And a lot of people seem to want to twist some of his words.
Have you read Engaging with Keller?
I have not read that.
That's a great little, I believe it's 5 or 6 chapters of basically directly dealing with primary sources from, a confessional Presbyterian point of view. And they very much take the tact you take, which is no one's saying he's a false teacher. We're absolutely not saying that. No one's saying he's saying anything else, but where there are disagreements, we want to engage with them, and because he's so well read and so well known, that's something that you can kind of, be prepared for as a person at that level. And I think you could say it too with Keller and also with like Abraham Kuyper. It's not so much what they said; it's what the people who followed each one of those people so closely did with what they said.
Right.
So I used to make the joke, like, Metallica is great. It's Metallica fans I can't stand. And so if you kind of apply it else, out from there, there is a little bit of that with theologians as well.
Right.
All right. So you go, your first example is not what we would call the Marxist influence or critical race theory. It's the Nashville Statement, and what prompted that? Now, you were a signatory of
Yes.
the Nashville Statement, in a fairly close vote. Well, actually, I don't remember how close the vote was. I think it was a foregone conclusion at some point. The PCA affirmed it as a biblical statement on human sexuality, and of course, that was what was sort of in response. Maybe not that the statement wasn't written in response to Revoice, but the PCA adopting it was in response to Revoice. So why did you sign the Nashville Statement?
Why did I sign it? I signed it because I strongly believe, particularly at a point where one of the chief pushbacks I get from liberal Christians is that, well, we're a creedal Christian and none of the creeds reference biblical sexuality. Therefore, it couldn't have been an important issue when the creeds were being written. Therefore, it's something we can agree to disagree on. And it frustrates me deeply that you have a group of people who claim to be Christians who want to hide behind creeds and pay no attention to scripture unless there are red letters, which last I checked, no one, including Jesus, ever spoke in red letters. They were put in later. And I thought that it would be useful to have a creedal statement on biblical sexual ethic in the church across denominations that multiple denominations could agree on as common ground. And the Nashville Statement, drafted by the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, I know those guys. They're friends of mine. I thought it was a good statement. They asked if I would be one of the initial signatories. I was flattered they asked. J.I. Packer, Al Mohler, J.D. Greer, Francis Chan, Russell Moore. I mean, the list goes on. John Piper, R.C. Sproul, all initial signatories to the same document. Frankly, I was a little humbled to be asked to be in the initial list with all people like that. But it also showed, I think, across those names that this was across denominations. It was something biblically based. And I was actually somewhat taken aback that this would even be controversial within the PCA. And that was one of the first warning signs I had that there really is something going on within the denomination I needed to pay attention to.
Well, I'll bet you read it before you signed it too.
Yes, I did.
That's good. You know, we've heard from our national legislators that it's not necessary to always read something before you vote on it or pass it. But I'm glad you did.
You know, being a former lawyer, I actually am notorious for signing things without ever having read them. But in this case, I figured I better.
Well, good. Well, we respect that. So, and we don't want to kill all the lawyers.
Well, I'm on the 11th of 12 recovery steps.
You know, there are several ministers in the PCA who are former lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you knew that. Fred Greco being a notable one. All right, on to the third section of your article, and it turns to revoice. Let me make a clarification there.
Yeah, I forgot to go in and update that. I'm glad you clarified it for me because I had totally forgotten it actually came out of the SBC.
Right. Well, that's not really accurate either. I mean, you're right. Within the PCA, a group of pastors has agitated against the Nashville Statement and started an organization called Revoice. So there were PCA figures and, of course, being near Covenant Seminary, being hosted by a PCA church in its first year, having a PCA pastor and a Covenant Seminary professor speak there. But it's not accurate to say that a group of PCA pastors formed Revoice. Nate Collins, who graduated from Southern Seminary, who is now a member of Greg Johnson's church, as far as I understand, he was sort of the founder.
Okay.
So that's a clarification. A lot of people have associated Revoice with the PCA because it was hosted at a PCA church. But I think it's fair to say that without the involvement of PCA affiliated people, Revoice would not be what it is, and it would not be controversial in our circles. So it's fair to say that no PCA, no Revoice as we know it. But you talk to all sorts of people. You talk to people on call-in shows and other people in the media and politicians. What's your take on the general description of Revoice, which the way you summarize it, that you can be a gay Christian, a celibate Christian, a non-doing all the gay stuff Christian, but still identifies gay. Why is that problematic, do you think?
Because you're putting a primary identifier on Christianity. You're modifying what it means to be a Christian that is based on a sexual identity that itself is considered sinful in Scripture. So you're not having homosexual relations, but yet you're defining yourself by being gay. and you're modifying what it means to be a Christian. And I think there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female. There's either Christian or not Christian. There's not a heterosexual Christian. There's not a gay Christian. There's just a Christian. Adding the modifiers, I think, it emphasizes the one at the expense of the other, and it emphasizes being gay at the expense of being Christian.
Well, it certainly confuses people too. I mean, there are people that I mean, there's a lot of nuance in this, and there's a big range of opinion and doctrine among side B Christians, side B gay Christians. That's what they call themselves. That's the non having gay sex gay Christians. That's just the way. That's what it is. There's no better way to describe it than that. But it's confusing to people, and something that has to be explained with great nuance and at great length. It may be valuable, but I think actually it's unwise. Well, I think they've gone about it in an unwise way. And I mean, you're not surprised that PCA church members and Southern Baptist church members and people on the street are confused by the gay Christian concept.
Right.
I mean, it's fraught with connotation and meaning. And I don't think those who oppose Revoice are actually being divisive. I think those that have propagated it have actually. I know they've caused a lot of trouble in the church, and I know churches that have left already because of it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you hear from people about Revoice?
Most of the people that I do know a few people who are sympathetic to it, and sympathetic because they understand that you're trying to bring people into a church where theological orthodoxy says within biblical sexual ethic, male and female attraction is natural and normal and God made, and homosexual attraction is not. How do you bring people in who do have homosexual attraction? And that's what they're trying to do, trying to make a space for them within Christianity, within Orthodox circles. The problem is, again, though, how do you at that point then have conversations about repentance of sin? And again, every single person that I've talked to who is opposed to Revoice does take this position of it confuses what it means to be a Christian when you're adding the modifier. So it'd be like, what's an Asian Christian? What's the difference between an Asian Christian and an American Christian versus a Nigerian Christian? What's the difference between a male Christian or a female Christian? We're all Christians. Adding the modifiers and then trying to discuss and approach it in a way separate from everyone else, I think in several cases of people I've talked to said they think it actually causes more problems than it solves because you are approaching particular people in a different way than the rest of the church.
Well, you move on from talking about Revoice to critical theory, and that's more in the racial reconciliation realm. But really, you didn't use the word. But what we're talking about here is intersectionality.
Right.
The fact that you can go in one paragraph from Revoice to the next paragraph, critical theory, Marxism, Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of sympathy between. I follow, I check in on Twitter on some of the Revoice associated people, and every one of them are on board with what we would call leftist approaches to racial reconciliation and social issues.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure you can explain to us that critical theory is about kind of a hierarchy or intersectionality as well, a hierarchy of oppressed people. Right. And, it's all about the oppressors and the oppressed. And these groups are told they should have affinity with one another, and they do. So what about how does Revoicism relate to critical theory and racial reconciliation?
So critical theory, let me just step back and say that the critical theorists would say, I'm not an expert, therefore I'm not qualified to talk about it. which is one of the funny postmodern ways that critical theorists operate, is unless you're an expert, you can't talk about it. And amongst themselves, they agree that they don't actually have a coherent thesis of what it is. What I can tell you it is, from reading those who do believe it and those who criticize it and have studied it, like Tim Keller, critical theory is derived from Marxist thought, that the world revolves around power structures, and power structures must be disrupted to provide equity and equality. So with critical theory, the power structures are devised around, in particular, race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity. And one who is the most powerful is the one who is white and male and Christian. And the one who is least powerful tends to be black and transgender, gay. And so each is relates to another in what is called intersectionality, the intersection of race and gender, sexual orientation, and it on a paradigm as to who is most powerful and who is not. Now, the way this translates then is that you yourself then become defined by your group. And this is where we get into revoice. You're defined by your group. You individually are not culpable for problems because the problems are derived from bad social policy. The way to fix social policy, or the way to fix problems, is not for you to fix yourself or to change your ways. It's to change the social policy that puts you in the place to cause you to behave in the way you do. The way you change social policy is to dominate the language. You are to subvert what are called the dominant paradigms in language. And by doing that, you preclude those who use language that is perceived as homophobic or bigoted or racist or power-centric. They're not allowed to have a role in the conversation, and instead must listen and declare their allyship with those who wish to engage the conversation from the oppressed classes. So the critical theorist then can accept the idea of a gay Christian because it qualifies the power relationship within Christendom. The problem with critical theory is not only is there a belief that there's a constant struggle, there can be no reconciliation ultimately and no forgiveness, because all you're doing are shifting power structures. And eventually the oppressed will become the oppressor and must then themselves be revolted against, although they tend not to dwell on that fact.
Yeah, let me bring up this quote from, it's sort of out of sequence, but let me bring up this quote from Ibram X. Kendi, and I think it's very telling. This is from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That's that. I think anyone would say that's possibly controversial. And of course, he justified it's. He would basically say it's just another form of affirmative action. He immediately goes to quote from Lyndon B. Johnson, "In the year that I was born," and then a Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun, who says, "In order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race." But I think taking account of race is, that's a big deal right now.
Right. We are to now prioritize race, and you must, if you are in one of the dominant power positions, declare your allyship. And the way you declare your allyship is to act out, whether it is in the form of protest or some other way of emoting to show that you care and are an ally, which is why we see so many of these young white kids burning down Kenosha, Wisconsin, to declare their allyship with the oppressed black minorities of Kenosha, Wisconsin, whose businesses they're burning down.
Yeah, that's it's all it's complicated and it's confusing.
It's the logic of the insane asylum is what it ultimately is. It actually makes no sense when you engage with it. Tim Keller, in fact, has written about critical theory and says it really doesn't make any sense at its heart. And there are parts of it that you cannot even engage with, and they themselves contradict each other ultimately within it.
Yeah, and that's where we are now in your article. I think you quote, language does not merely describe reality, it constructs or creates it. Anyway, our listeners can read that, but you do point to Keller as someone who's helpful against critical theory.
Right. He writes about secular forms of justice in a great article that I linked to, both on conservative and liberal and postmodern views of justice in society, and compares them with a biblical construct for justice in society. It was very thought-provoking, and particularly for someone who, while a Christian, is also a conservative political activist and former elected official. But taking on, at the end, he saves a lot of his wit and wisdom for what's going on in postmodern society and a post-truth society where facts really don't matter. You encounter this a lot, frankly, with the practitioners of critical theory who can't agree on basic facts, and who argue that you must take them at their word. And the way you take them at their word is you must parrot back exactly what they say, not put what they say in your own words. To do that is to be exerting power over them, which you're not supposed to do.
Or maybe it's colonization.
Right.
Or appropriation or something. So you move on from there. So again, you consider Keller to be an ally in this case. But let's, as you move on, you move into the pseudo-intellectual charge you have, which I gather you mean it's people trying to appropriate these theories for use in the church, but I think you would say unwisely.
People who are appropriating things that they really don't necessarily understand, but also I say pseudo-intellectual because I'm finding, particularly within the PCA, given the intellectual pedigree of a lot of people in the PCA and the background, a lot of doctors, a lot of lawyers and academics and the like, there is a strain within the PCA of people who like to use large words to compensate for the fact that they really don't know what they're talking about.
Well, and I'll just tell you, I'm in some private forums with PCA people. Someone, not me, linked to your article in one of them. I linked in another. I linked in a fairly conservative confessional old school forum, and they all liked it. In the larger forum, which had a much wider representation, they didn't like what you had to say about this. Everyone likes to hear their friends and themselves spoken well of,
right?
And but as a political person, you're sort of used to plain speaking, and I mean that's your job to give your judgment and speak it.
Right. Honestly, I do believe that we do have an obligation to be kind to one another, but kindness at the expense of truth, I don't necessarily know that we need to. And I thought very strongly when I was writing a piece like this that it necessarily meant that if I was going to use the phrase pseudo-intellectuals and those who would move the denomination to the left, that I certainly should be willing to bring up the names of the people I was thinking about, whether it's Scott Sauls or Greg Thompson.
All right, so you mentioned Greg Thompson, who, again, is not pastoring a church, but is still, as a teaching elder, he's a member of a presbytery, and he has relation to the presbytery. But you noted that he's very supportive of the idea of reparations. Do you think racial reparations, is a wise thing to bring into the church or to speak for as a church?
No, I don't think so. And the reason I don't is very simple. The people who mostly advocate racial reparations are people of the left, secularists, who are hostile to the church to begin with. And so what those who would advocate for racial reparations within the church are essentially arguing is that we're going to make allies of those who are hostile to us, and we're going to embrace their cause and their claims when they deny the essential truths of Christianity, including that we're sinners and need to repent of sin, and we're going to affect a social policy that will then be devoid of Christ in the name of making people whole, when we're not actually going to be making people whole. We may throw some money around at them. And frankly, I think we've seen historically in society what happens is secularists like to throw money at problems and walk away from it. And if anything, I think if the church engages at the level of racial reparations, we'll actually be making the problem worse long term by allowing people to absolve themselves of their conscience that they've thrown money at the problem in a secular way, and we still haven't managed to share the gospel with them.
Well, there's some people within and without the church who think we need to bring race into every last thing, and that it colors everything, and that our history, our involvement historically, of course, the PCA has been around since 1973, which is interesting. But the denomination where we came from, the Southern Church, because we were associated with that, we are thought to be guilty of all their sins.
Right.
I want to play a clip from Greg Thompson. I think it's important to know, for people to understand how seriously he takes this. We don't have to agree with him, but as you hear what he says, if he's right, we should be very concerned. So let's hear this. Well, let me unmute it first. This is Eric. You know how live radio goes sometimes.
Yes, I do.
There we go.
Sometimes our talk of cultural transformation is contextless. We talk about it as though it doesn't exist in an actual culture, with an actual history, with actual realities. But I want you to know that when you, as Americans here, people that are working or living specifically in America, talk about restoring all things, you're living in a very particular context. And do you know what it is? You were living in one of the longest standing white supremacist social orders in history. This is beyond dispute. And when I say white supremacists, you should not be thinking about clan hoods. You should be thinking about systems and structures that make things easy for people like me and hard for people who don't look like me. That is a fact. In our policy life, in our economic life, in our political life, it is a fact, and you are living in the midst of that right now. And I want you to understand that to talk about transforming everything and not to talk about white supremacy is to lie. Because what it does, it perpetuates this privileged illusion that we can go about our lives making everything great, which is what white folk have done all the time. There's nothing different about that. And so if we want to talk about transforming all things, we have to talk about it in a very specific cultural context. If we don't foreground this, we are abandoning our culture, not transforming it. And more than that, we are perpetuating the systems that gave rise to this culture. So what does that mean? That means very specifically, if you were working in this cultural context and you were seeking to do that, this creation, fall, redemption, consummation, renewal of all things through every sphere of creation, and you are not actively thinking about the cultural context that's 400 years this year, and there is no parallel to that anywhere in the history of the world, then you are deceived.
Well, that's pretty strong stuff, but it's pretty plain, and you hear a lot in there about transformationalism, which I think it's fair to say that Keller was a great popularizer of that concept, although it existed with Schaeffer. We got a good dose of it from the RPCES when they came in with their institutions, Covenant Seminary and Covenant College. But what's your reaction to that clip? I mean,
it's 21st century Gnosticism is what it is. You've got to embrace his critical theories and his worldview, and your eyes will be open to a white supremacy that pervades every aspect of society. I agree with my friend Matthew Frank, who wrote in Newsweek last week that the idea of systemic racism is a conspiracy, that your denial of it is proof that you're part of the conspiracy and part of the problem. It pervades everything. And at one point, I would argue that in this country there was pretty pervasive systemic racism within institutions, and we fought a civil war, and many people died, and it took a very long time to ultimately get civil rights in this country. And now we've had our first black president. We've had multiple black members of the Supreme Court, and if you're still convinced that there's pervasive white supremacy in society, go stand out on the street corner. Hand out your business card to people and then start uttering all sorts of terrible racist things and see what happens to you. And if we really are a white supremacist society, you'll keep your job, maybe get promoted. But I'm pretty sure that's not actually going to happen. And now, of course, he will deflect and say otherwise and say that I'm diffusing the situation. But this is also part of the problem. If you read what he writes on critical theory, that only the experts are allowed to chime in on it, and people who frequently distort it. And then he also defends Christian Marxism, which has never worked out well in the world, just like Marxism itself. So I'm really disturbed that what I hear is a level of Gnosticism in the 21st century that's invaded the church, that there is some sort of secret knowledge that if you'll just open your eyes to, you'll see the way things actually work. That's not gospel-centered. That's just conspiracy-minded.
Yeah, and one of the things I think about, we've got my church, we've got members from different parts of the country, different parts of the world. What if I came to a PCA church as an Asian student or an immigrant from Mexico, and the major emphasis of this church was everything was colored by racial reconciliation, colored by that emphasis, the white versus black, 19th and 20th century problems. Where does that leave me as someone that doesn't have any skin in that game?
Right.
Well, it just doesn't make sense to me to bring that into the church to that degree, constantly, forever.
I agree, and I also think that it sounds to me in hearing him speak, and I had not heard that clip before from him, that John Calvin said our minds are perpetual factories of idols, and I do believe that there are a lot of well-meaning people within Christendom who have made racial reconciliation an idol, and to me it sounds like, listening to him, he's one of them.
Well, and yeah, we don't impugn the motives of anyone. It's a good thing. Well, but we have to make choices about what's the best way to do things, and there's there's a divide on philosophy of ministry. That's one of the things it's called. And some of it's around spirituality of the church. Some of it's I think there's kind of two things: what we believe. I think there's three things. It's doctrine. It's what we believe the church's role is, and what the church does. And there's a lot of different opinions on that in the PCA.
Right.
And we're not here to beat up on Greg Thompson, but I wanted to highlight a quote. You used the M word, Marxism, and this was from a Facebook post he did where he seemed to defend some aspects of Marxism. And I thought this quote was a little suspect. He said that Marxism, quote, never ever made a serious impact on American institutions. I think the history of the Cold War might tell you that's not
right.
Exactly true. But then he quickly says the fact that no serious impact was made cannot be said for undemocratic and fascist forms of anti-Marxism. So I guess then that's Senator McCarthy he refers to. I happen to believe Senator McCarthy was right about most of what he contended was true. He didn't go about it in a very, very winsome way. But maybe we're just old-fashioned, but sort of any positive cast on Marxism rubs some of us the wrong way.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, he wrote further in this piece to understand Marxism, you really need to understand how bad the Christians were at the time, that Marxism arose in response to that, and defended that just because others who purportedly claim to embrace Marxism did bad things. We shouldn't say that Marxism itself is bad. And then things like this. And I did notice, for example, he's dismissive of the idea of cultural Marxism. He dismisses the idea of Marx having any influence in America, but everything against Marx does. This again is I would say amounts to a pseudo-intellectualism, a defense of Marxism that is rambling in what he wrote, and also a little bit, in my mind, disturbing to have someone who is in the PCA as a teaching elder, who is influential in the policy of shaping certain church policies within certain churches in the PCA, who would defend a policy that historically, in every way it's ever been implemented, has led deeply to the persecution of Christians around the world, including the Christian Marxists. When you look at how it played out in Central and South America or in Africa, where the standard trope of the Christian Marxists, he specifically defends the Christian Marxists within Catholicism, have eventually evolved into a cult of people who believe you can't have communion unless you're killing the capitalists. And that doesn't work out well for us. I was frankly flabbergasted to read that someone within the PCA would mount a defense of Marxism, let alone Christian Marxism, in a position like that. It's something that I wanted to raise awareness of within the church as well.
Yeah, I think the defense of the Marxist among the Roman Catholics, I think that rubbed me the wrong way, because I'm not even sure they were Christians, for one thing. I certainly don't assume that Roman Catholics are Christians, or that Rome is, much of a Christian church. I was something of a student of the Central American conflicts when I was younger. Actually went to Honduras during the Contra War. I've seen a few things, and that doesn't sit too well with me. But that's maybe that's just me.
Well, I see. I don't think it is just you, and I was unaware of that piece until several separate people sent it to me and said, you've got to see this. And it's bothersome to me. Look, I grew up in the 1980s in Dubai in the Middle East during the Cold War, and when I find people who say, well, Marxism just hasn't really been tried in the way that Karl Marx intended it to, that never ends well, and I'm deeply skeptical of anyone who makes that argument.
Yeah, I mean, I became a leftist. I thought I was a socialist in college for a few years, like everyone else, but it didn't really didn't stick. And I was a newspaper photographer, and I think what made me a conservative was my contact with real life.
Right.
I've been a few places and seen a few things, and that doesn't mean you necessarily come to certain conclusions, but I can point to, some confirmatory experiences along the way. So again, you did focus on some things that Greg Thompson has written. We could talk about other aspects ecclesiologically, but this is he is sort of an emblem maybe for a certain kind of progressive or someone who's open to some of these ideas and thinks they can be rightfully employed.
Right.
I guess you probably wouldn't agree that like the ill-conceived Resolution 9 at the Southern Baptist Convention, which
Right.
they basically, I don't know if they knew what they were voting for, but they basically voted that critical theory was just a pretty good tool that they could use.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure in reading the writings of a lot of the people who supported it, they really had no idea what it was. And unfortunately, those in the PCA who are dabbling in it do tend to know what it is.
Yeah.
And they constantly tell me, for example, when I was writing about this and interacting with people, that, well, you just don't understand. And no, actually, I do understand it, and I want no part of it.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of smart people in the PCA. But I was reading just this week. It said that highly intelligent people are good at justifying themselves, and they can talk themselves into to believing that the course that they've chosen is the right one,
Right.
In the face of great contrary evidence. So I don't know if I'm highly intelligent, but I'm pretty good at that myself. So you're probably not. You're you're sanctified beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. All right.
My
so,
wife keeps me humble.
Boy, howdy, as they say. Yes. So that's a famous Tim Keller quote. We used to have fun with the image associated with it. He was quoted as saying, "There's nothing more relaxing than humility."
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm still trying to figure that out and still trying to become humble and relaxed. That'd be good too. All right. So we've been talking about the PCA. You talk about the leaders of the denomination embracing some of these ideas. I think one of the things to remember about the PCA is that our stated clerk has no real power.
Right.
When you talk about leaders, you're talking about influential people.
Yes.
But you're not talking about official. There are no offices in the PCA.
We have no popes.
Right. And well, yeah. I think
we have
some
Tim Keller, but we have no
some
popes.
bishops. We have a bishop. We have the Bishop of Manhattan. But man, I don't know who the next one will be. But I did want to point out that our idea of leaders is a little different,
right,
than others. You note the connection of some of these ideas with the PCA's denominational seminary. I was so naive when I joined the PCA. I thought RTS was our denominational seminary in Jackson. I thought it had to be, and I was wrong, and I was corrected. But it is Covenant Seminary in St. Louis, where the next General Assembly will be. But you make the good point. The PCA has always set itself apart as curious and intellectual. I think curious means open to cultural engagement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's in our DNA, or at least became more in our DNA over time, especially with the absorption of the RPCES. You probably know that Covenant Seminary and Covenant College came to us with the joining and receiving of the RPCES in 1980, I think it was. So that's why I say maybe it was inserted more than was there at the beginning.
Right.
So the PCA is different. I could point you to something that Brian Chappell wrote many years ago, saying that we, quote, punched above our weight in influence, and we're sort of the thought leader denomination. But I think your concern is that our thought leaders not lead us astray.
Right.
All right,
yeah.
So,
I spent a lot of time actually bothering to reach out. A lot of people think when I write, well, this is just Erick Erickson and his thoughts. And yes, it is. But I try, particularly in something like this, to make sure I understand it, to reach out to people. And I wanted to be very careful not to just focus on people at my local church and my local presbytery, where one of our pastors has been saying, on radio, you really need to talk about critical theory. This is becoming a thing even within our denomination. So I reached out, and I talked to PCA pastors in California and elsewhere, South Carolina, Tennessee, Illinois, people I've known, people I don't know very well, but was connected with. And I was stunned, one, by the unanimity of opinion and also their cautions on approaching some within the denomination. I adamantly dissuaded by a great many of them from approaching a couple of people within the denomination. But there was a concern that continued to come up that I have heard from other friends of mine within the PCA about Covenant Seminary, just that it has gone so far into pastoral care and culture that it almost has a hard time teaching people to be weary of culture. I actually had a very good friend of mine. I shouldn't say good friend, an internet friend of mine, text messaged me about this piece, who went to Covenant and said it was years into his ministry as a minister where he finally realized that he needed a healthier dose of against culture than what he ever picked up on in seminary. And he said some of the stories he's told me and other pastors within the PCA makes me think we necessarily do need to have a reckoning within the PCA of some of the things that are happening within our denomination in terms of not just being curious about and wanting to engage with culture, but flirting with culture in a worldly way. If the things of the world hate the things of God, I think we need to be careful of dabbling in and embracing the things of the world.
Yeah, you end the piece by saying a Christian who thinks he can co-opt Marxist thought, and I'm sure you would also have said the insights of critical theory, things, or some of or intersectionality, that sort of thing. All those things sort of rolled up together. Anyone who thinks they can co-opt that for the church is a Christian whose pride will come before his fall. So you think it's prideful to think that we can handle sinful things sinlessly, I think.
Right.
Does that, because it's kind of the hold my beer thing. This has never worked before. This is dangerous, but we can do it.
But we can do it. I come back to the Lord of the Rings, which I love, and Saruman believing that he, chief among everyone else, would somehow be able to control or handle Sauron or make alliance with him, and that he would get the upper hand. There was a level of pride there. We constantly see this happen within Christendom and elsewhere, the fall of people who believe they're going to embrace a level of worldliness, and this time they'll be able to handle it. And I think the story of Christianity around the world is you're not going to be able to handle that worldliness because that worldliness is hostile to you. But there's a level of pride out there that somehow this time we've got the inside track to be able to do it. And we need to be way more cautious as a denomination in engaging and using the tools of the world to try to define us. It would be very much like, let's use Freudian psychology to try to analyze the relationship between Jesus and John. I don't know anyone who would want to do that, and yet that's essentially what this is. Let's use critical theory to analyze power structures. Within the Bible, there are plenty of stories on how power is abused against the powerless. We don't need critical theory to tell us that.
Yeah, and you mentioned Saruman. He had that magic bowling ball where he could see things.
Right.
And that's sort of the Gnosticism you're talking about. We think we've got the good sense or the learning, or we've gone beyond theological and ecclesiological matters. We're delving into social sciences, which are necessarily dominated. I mean, education and social sciences, all the soft sciences, are dominated by Marxism. I mean, I know that's the case. I had a family member who was in education, and I've seen the stacks of books, Paolo Freire and conferences that they attended that had Bill Ayers and Angela Davis there, for instance, things like that. That's for real. But what you're saying is, and you end with, the church needs to be warned. You think we need to be warned not to think we can sort of get away with trafficking in some of these ideas.
That, and also that there are already those within the denomination who think they can. And again, I would go back to the larger piece that Greg Thompson put on Facebook, where essentially he says that unless you're an expert in critical theory, you can't really talk about critical theory because you can't understand critical theory. And if that's the case, that very much is, again, it goes back in my mind to a level of Gnosticism, that you must learn the secret knowledge to be able to get the special insight. And to get that secret knowledge, you're led into the world and into a philosophy that derived from the world, and not only derived from the world, but explicitly, including in what Greg Thompson writes, his acknowledgement of it, derived in the world explicitly as against the church.
Yeah, well, it's quite a thing. We talk about 2020. This didn't start in 2020. It's been going on for several years. I first became aware of most of these things around 2015. But it's with us. And we do know that God's sovereign over the church, that he loves her and will preserve her. But he does that through members and officers and maybe even radio guys. So, anything you'd like to say about these things before we wrap up? Any words of encouragement Or
again, it so much of it for me goes back to Jeremiah 29. Seek the welfare of the city in which you live, and there you'll find your welfare. And we have so many people who want to be the next big rock star in the church, and they want to have an expansive ministry that expands beyond the welfare of their city. And in doing so, they're embracing a level of worldliness. And if we're really going to solve the issue of racial reconciliation, we're going to do it within our own church and our own community, not trying to shape social policy in Washington, D.C. with a bunch of people who really don't embrace our faith and don't even recognize the concept of sin.
Yeah, well, that's, of course, we're also told to lead quiet lives. And we talked about Ecclesiastes a week or so ago. And, basically Ecclesiastes says, curb your enthusiasm. You're not going to fix everything, and you're not going to be terribly successful. Everything will be fixed, and Jesus will be successful. But in the meantime, you're probably not going to be.
Right.
We certainly should try to do what we can, but realistically and with humility, I might say. All right, so you're the political guy. So as we end up, explain to us the appeal of Donald Trump and who's going to win the election in 7 weeks.
I don't know who's going to win the election. I think the appeal of Donald Trump is a lot of people who feel embattled culturally in this country, put upon by others, and made to embrace agendas and cultural phenomenon that they were raised not to. And Donald Trump is the guy who throws punches. They feel like no one else has fought for them in the past in the way he will. I didn't support the man in 2016 and had 3 people show up on my doorstep to threaten me and my family for not doing so, and stuck to my guns and didn't support him. I'll vote for him in 2020, but I really do feel like there's a lesson here I'm meditating on of how much modern American Christianity is very much like the kings of Israel, who were constantly trying to find alliances between the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians instead of relying on the sovereignty of God. And I see a great many American Christians who are trying to find alliances between conservatives, liberals, Democrats, and Republicans instead of relying on the sovereignty of God.
Well, that's it's going to be a difficult. It's about 8. What is it? No, 6 weeks. I said 7
Not
weeks.
soon enough. I'm ready for it to be done.
Yeah. This is September 17th, and the election is on November the 3rd. So do your math. We're going to have a live show. So I'm sure you're not going to be busy on election nights. If you get
no, not at all.
If you get bored, you just call in to us, and we'll take all the wisdom or lament that you have that you have to offer.
Oh, there'll be a lot of lament regardless of who wins.
Oh yeah. You need to get the famous gif of the lady in front of the White House.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. We might see that again. In fact, we've already made a graphic for our election night show, and it features her prominently, I must say.
Wow.
Well, it is. It's good to see. I mean, a lot of PCA people, they want cultural engagement. You're actually doing it. You may not be doing it in the way that everyone would prefer, but you're actually doing that. I mean, you're talking to people about all sorts of things under the sun for 5 hours a day. And,
5 hours a day. So my favorite seminary professor at RTS is Derek Thomas, who is the senior pastor at First Pres in Columbia, South Carolina. When I was taking his classes, I would pick him up from the airport. I had filled in for Rush Limbaugh one day, and we actually were both coming back from a trip. We were on the same little tram at the Atlanta airport, the little underground train, and I didn't realize he was there, and he came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder, and he says, "I just want you to know, whether you think so or not, you've already got a pulpit. You need to keep it." So I recognize sometimes what James said about pastors, which is one reason I've endeavored to keep taking classes at RTS. I'll be one of those perpetual students who never actually graduates. I'll just keep taking classes as they add them.
Well, it can't hurt you. And my wife may take some seminary classes when she retires one day, and nice. She could certainly handle them much better than me if she chooses to do that. So, you are the first guest on our show who's filled in for Rush Limbaugh. So there is that.
There is that.
So if I get sick some night, maybe you can fill in for me, and then you'll have covered the whole range.
There you go.
But you
Happy to
couldn't
do it.
You couldn't fill in for Resby. He's the only one who can tell everyone good night. So anything you want to alert us to? I mean, you're on Substack now.
Yes. ewerickson.substack.com. Basically, EW Erickson everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Substack. That would be me.
You know, I think, did you start Red State?
A lot of people give me credit for it. So 4 friends of mine started Red State. They brought me in very early. They realized I was a lawyer at the time and they needed a free lawyer. So that's what I did. And then they put me in charge of it, much to their chagrin, perhaps. But I was there until 2016 and decided to go start theresurgent.com, where I am now, in large part because Red State got bought by a radio company and I have a competing radio show on a different network and wanted to do more integration of radio into the web.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Resurgent because that was what I had forgotten. So, yes, easy to find Erick Erickson. You might see him on the networks or on the the tram at the Atlanta airport. So just
never know.
Watch out for him. Well, thanks again for joining us. Resby will tell everyone good night. And, like we always say, don't be an Erdman. If you don't know much about Machen, you won't know what that means, but you need to go visit Machen's grandparents' house.
I will do it.
All right. And Resby, are you with us?
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Eric,
good.
for coming on and for talking and speaking with us. We got a lot of great engagement through some of the comments that were going on. People, I think people are comforted to know that the PCA is not a huge denomination, but there's more people in the PCA out there than you might first think. So great to hear from you and all that you're doing, and wish you the best of luck moving forward. And may we all survive 2020 mostly intact as best we can. And hopefully we'll see you again down the road. But thank you to everyone for listening. We're PresbyCast. Enjoy the music on the way out, and don't be an Erdman.
I know there's a man, he'll set me free, and that is why I love to call his name. Oh, yeah. My love won't be in vain. That's why I love to call his name. You know the Lord, he moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. Well, he plants his footsteps on the sea, and he rides on every storm. Well, he speaks my name when the battle gets rough. I've got Jesus, and that's enough. And that's why I love you. Well, I love to call
Magic on the internet worldwide.